Hello, Internet. I am Pastor Recoil, and welcome to my parish. Today is the 6th Sunday of Easter, and we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Pastor Recoil's Parish, where I talk about some things that you may not have heard about in church, either because it's not quite appropriate for all audiences, or it just isn't something that's easy to talk about in a sermon. The readings for the 6th Sunday of Easter are Acts 17, 22 through 31, Psalm 66, 8 through 20, 1 Peter 3, 13 through 22, and John 14, 15 through 21. Today we're going to talk about evangelism, conversion, and failure to kind of do both. In our reading from Acts 17, the Apostle Paul finds himself in Athens in Greece. And as he's wandering around the city, he becomes deeply troubled because the city is full of idols. And Paul, being of Jewish heritage and a Jewish Christian, was really uncomfortable with that. Idols are a big no-no for Jewish people, even still today. And so Paul would go around and he kind of would start debating anyone who would debate with him. And Athens, being a city of master debaters, was happy to oblige. But the Athenians weren't quite buying what Paul was selling. And so they brought him before the Areopagus, which is either Athens's actual judicial council or the venue in which Athens' judicial council meets. And they asked Paul to say more about what he'd been arguing with everyone about, these foreign divinities that Paul was preaching. And so Paul stood up and preached. He talked about an altar to an unknown God that he saw, and then used that altar to proclaim the God of Israel, the maker of heaven and earth. He talked about how that God made humans to want to seek out that God. And then he used Greek poetry, specifically Epimenides and Aratus, to argue his point, finally ending up talking about Jesus and the final judgment and resurrection. Over the years, this speech has been held up by Christians as an example of contextualizing the Christian faith when sharing it with an audience of non-Christians. It's something preachers are told to emulate and to figure out how to make Christianity relevant to its audience. But while there is a point there that Christianity should adapt to its audience and be incarnate in whatever community it's expressed in, there's one problem with using the Areopagus sermon as an example. It was, by the standards of Paul's other missionary endeavors, a pretty big failure. See, when Paul started talking about the resurrection, most folk in the Areopagus checked out. They didn't want to listen anymore, and only a few people, 2 of them named and a handful of others, became believers. That's a far cry from Paul's usual successes of drawing large crowds and planting churches wherever he went. And I think Paul's big issue here was he was trying too hard to fit in with the philosophers in Athens. And in doing so, he neglected some actual details. He tried to intellectualize what Christianity was instead of focusing on preaching a God who would become human, die, and rise, and in doing so announce the reign of God in the world. On Paul's next stop in the city of Corinth, that's basically what he did. At first he tried to argue with folk, but then he stopped and he just started preaching again. And he ended up staying in Corinth for a year and a half and growing the Corinthian church. There seems to still be a sense, though, that Christianity can be argued for someone, that you can argue someone into salvation. And if you just present the right arguments, a non-believer will be convinced to go, oh, well, yes, this is absolutely for me. But how often does that really happen? Faith isn't really something you can argue, in my experience. You can't prove something that has to be taken on faith. So I think in a lot of ways, the example of the Areopagus is meant to remind us that we're not supposed to try and prove Christianity. It's not about trying to become so fresh and relevant that we don't look any different from the world around us. Instead, our call as followers of Jesus is to announce the reign of God in the world, the reign that was inaugurated by Jesus' resurrection, and to be beacons of love, peace, and joy in a world that rarely is those things, and to be different, to live in ways that stand out because of the love that we have for one another and for the world. So if you want to see more content like this, check out the links to my right, or click the logo below my face to subscribe so you'll know when my next video comes out. Thank you for watching, and take the time this week to love your neighbor as yourself, especially if you don't like them all that much.